She worked as a professional actor from the age of 8. Still gets small residual checks to this day as an adult. The kind of quiet little reminder that her childhood job technically never fully ended. But when she finally got real access to her own account for the first time, she found out that 94% of everything she'd ever earned was already gone, spent by someone else years before she ever had a say in it. 2 stories today about parents who quietly decided their own child's paycheck belonged to them. She started acting professionally at 8 years old. Small roles at first, the kind of parts that barely register unless you're specifically looking for them, but steady work. By the time she was 14, she'd built up a real resume. Commercials, guest spots, the occasional bigger project. Even now, well into adulthood and years removed from that entire chapter of her life, small residual checks still land in her account every so often. A strange little echo of a job she stopped doing over a decade ago. For most of that time, though, her account was really only ever a name on paperwork. Like most working child actors, her earnings were handled entirely by her parents. Deposited, managed, and spent without her ever really knowing the details. Because what 8, 10, 12-year-old is expected to manage their own finances anyway? That's simply how it works for kids in the industry. You trust the adults in your life to handle it responsibly because you don't have another option. It was a strange, almost mundane conversation that finally cracked the whole thing open. Her parents mentioned, in passing, that there were delinquent dues that had built up on her account over the past 5 years. Some kind of maintenance or service fee she'd never even known existed, quietly accumulating in the background while nobody mentioned it to her. She paid it off without thinking much of it, mostly just wanting to clear the issue. What she didn't expect was that clearing that fee would finally give her real, full access to the account for the very first time in her life. She logged in expecting, if anything, a modest number, some leftover residuals, nothing dramatic. Instead, she was looking at a cumulative total from her entire childhood career, and it was significantly higher than she'd ever imagined. That single moment sent her straight into her old bank statements, working backward year by year, trying to understand where all of it had actually gone. The math, once she did it, was hard to look away from. Roughly 94% of everything she'd earned as a child had already been spent, before she ever had access to a single dollar of it herself. The only portion that had ever been legally protected from being touched at all was the 15% required under the Coogan Act, a law specifically written to stop exactly this kind of situation, which sets aside a portion of a child performer's earnings into a trust account that can't be accessed until they turn 18. Even that money, she didn't actually withdraw or use until well after she'd already finished college. It just sat there, untouched, the one sliver of her own childhood income that nobody else had been able to reach. She's not naive about where some of that other 85% legitimately went. Acting lessons cost money. So does transportation to auditions and sets, wardrobe, headshots, all the invisible overhead that comes with being a working child performer. She fully expects a real chunk of her earnings went toward keeping her career actually running. But when she sat with the actual numbers, they didn't come anywhere close to adding up to 94% of a total that large. There's a wide, uncomfortable gap between reasonable career expenses and almost everything. Gone. What makes it sting more is where she is right now in her own life. She's an adult, supporting herself entirely on her own income. Rent, a job, student loans stacking up the way they do for most people her age. And there's a very specific, very quiet kind of frustration in doing that math and realizing how different her financial footing might look today if even a portion of what she earned as a child had simply been left alone, saved, or invested instead of spent. To her credit, she isn't approaching this looking for a fight. She describes her relationship with her parents as genuinely good, and she has no interest in detonating that over money that's already gone.
What she's actually looking for is clarity, some honest accounting of where it went, and maybe just being heard on how strange it feels to find this out as an adult, years after the fact, almost by accident, because of an unrelated late fee she happened to pay off. She's spent a fair amount of time since then just sitting with the numbers, doing the kind of quiet mental math anyone in her position probably would. If that missing 80% or so had simply stayed put, even in a basic savings account, let alone actually invested somewhere over a decade or more, she'd be looking at a completely different financial reality today. Not lottery money different, but the kind of difference that means a down payment instead of another year of renting, or breathing room instead of counting down to the next paycheck. That's the part that's hardest to just let go of, even for someone who genuinely isn't looking to blow up a good relationship over it.
It's worth understanding why the Coogan Act even exists in the first place, because it makes our story land a little differently. The law is named after Jackie Coogan, a child star from the silent film era who, as an adult, discovered his own parents had spent virtually every dollar he'd earned as a kid, leaving him with almost nothing, despite having been one of the highest paid child performers of his time. The backlash was big enough that California eventually passed a law specifically to stop it from happening to the next generation of kid actors, requiring a portion of their earnings to sit untouched in a trust until they were legal adults. It's a real working legal protection. And yet, decades later, it only manages to protect a slice of what a working child actor actually earns. The other 85% still runs entirely on trust. Trust that the adults responsible for that money will treat it as belonging to the kid who earned it, not as a household budget line with no name attached. She hasn't decided yet exactly how, or even whether, to bring this up directly with her parents. Part of her wants a real conversation. Not an accusation, just an honest accounting of where it went and why. Part of her worries that even asking calmly will land as an attack on people she still loves and still mostly trusts. For now, she's sitting in that uncomfortable middle place a lot of people in her situation end up in. Not angry enough to cut anyone off, not okay enough to just forget the number she saw on that screen. She's far from the only person who's run into this exact wall. Here's a shorter story from someone who asked the same question her mother and got an answer that says a lot more than it probably meant to.
Another woman's version of this same story is smaller in scale, but somehow just as telling. As a kid, she did modeling. Nothing major, no big campaigns or television deals, just the kind of steady, low-key work that still adds up over time. Newspaper ads, the occasional print job, small paychecks that came in regularly enough to matter. Years later, as an adult, she finally asked her mother the same simple question so many former child performers eventually ask. Where did the money go? Her mother's reaction wasn't guilt or an explanation or even mild embarrassment. It was genuine confusion. She seemed to have no real understanding of why her daughter would be upset that she'd simply spent all of it, as if the question itself didn't quite make sense to her.
Here's the detail that reframes the entire exchange. This is the same woman who, at some point, told her daughter, plainly, sincerely, that she was her most valuable possession. Not her daughter, not her child, a possession. And listening to how casually that money disappeared with zero framework for why any of it should have been set aside for the person who actually earned it, that word choice suddenly makes a lot more sense than it probably should. What's almost more revealing than the money itself is the total absence of any framework on her mother's end for why the question was
even worth asking. There was no, I know I should have saved some of it. No flicker of guilt, not even a defensive excuse about where it went. Just genuine bewilderment that her daughter would expect anything different. As if a child's paycheck and a household's grocery budget had always occupied the exact same mental category in her mind, with no line between them at all.
That's really the thread connecting both of these stories, even though the dollar amounts are worlds apart. It was never really about malice in either case. Nobody set out planning to take something from their own kid. It's something closer to a blind spot, an assumption so deeply held that it never even occurred to either parent that the money passing through their hands, earned by a child too young to manage it themselves, was ever anything other than theirs by default. The Coogan Act exists precisely because that blind spot is common enough to need an actual law protecting against it. And even then, as both of these stories show, it only ever covers a fraction of what actually gets spent long before a kid grows up enough to ask where they went. 2 different families, one identical pattern underneath it. A child does real work, earns real money, and somewhere along the way, a parent quietly decides that money was always theirs to spend, no different from a paycheck of their own. If something like this happened to you or to someone you know, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe for a new story every day. See you tomorrow.